Here we go, verse 21. After we had torn ourselves away from them. That just really jumped off the page at me. I was talking about yesterday, just, it's really powerful to just see how connected that they were there in Ephesus together. This was a really difficult thing for Paul to leave them and to head to Jerusalem. So after they had torn themselves away from them, they set out to sea and sailed straight to Kos. The next day we went to Rhodes, and from there to Patera. Just kidding. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went aboard, and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. Finding the disciples there, we stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. But when our time was up, we left and continued on our way. Again, this is first person, and we talked about this yesterday, picking up from chapter 16. So again, Luke is writing in first person. All right. All the disciples and their wives and children accompanied us out of the city, and there on the beach we knelt and prayed. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. We continued on our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemy, where we greeted the brothers and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip, the evangelist, one of the 7. Just a quick little note there. 7 is capitalized. That goes back to Acts chapter 6. And you want to kind of flip back there when we're done here. You'll see what's going on with the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." Yeah, this is crazy. That if your name is Agabus, you probably do stuff like this. All right, verse 12. When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. But Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manasseh, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples, probably since Pentecost. Verse 17, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God and said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed?" And commentators on this say between somewhere around 40,000. So amazing. Okay. "And all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow," and this is a Nazirite vow. And typically the way this would go is you weren't allowed to be around dead people, you couldn't have any wine, and at the end of it, you couldn't shave or anything like that. You couldn't cut your hair, and then at the very, very end of it, you would shave your head off, and then you would burn all that hair as part of a sacrifice. And this isn't the first time that we're reading of this. Back in chapter 18, I was just looking back a few pages, verse 18. We know that Paul did this as well. So that's the kind of vow they're talking about. Verse 24, "Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved." And I looked into that a little bit. It just struck me why would they need to pay their expenses? Well, they were taking off of work. That was one thing. Also, it was just expensive because of the different sacrifices that would happen during a Nazirite vow. They would have to make a number of different sacrifices. So it was costly. The lambs that they would sacrifice, and just all the different things that went on during this Nazirite vow, it really was a costly deal. And so they're telling Paul that pretty much you're going to pick up the tab. Really interesting here. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports, Paul, if you do this, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. All right, we read about that in chapter 15. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then they went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. Unbelievable. Let me just make a comment here. All right, Paul has the most influence in the ancient world at this time, besides Caesar. The influence that this guy has is something that I don't really think we can wrap our minds around. Second to that, the favor that he had. God was using Paul more than he was using any other person on planet Earth. And when you have any kind of success, when you have any kind of influence like that, typically the cousin of influence is pride. And what usually happens over time is that kind of person submits to no one. And as I was reading through this just blew me away. As I looked into what did it mean for him to go along with this kind of vow. It wasn't just him cutting his hair. No, it was costly. Imagine someone, in essence saying, hey, we've got like a $10,000 bill that we need you to pay to try to appease some people, and we need you to kind of do some things that you don't really believe in anymore. Unbelievable how we see Paul again show us, as we're diving into the Word here, that he was a person that was taking the high road. He was a person that submitted to authority. He was a person that did not get caught up in pride, and he, right here, we see in the text, do something that I'm not sure many of us would have done. He submitted to these guys, and we see back to his mission again that he was all things to all people. To the Jew, he was a Jew. To the Gentile, he was a Gentile. And again, we see that that mission and those values that Paul had are what drove him to make a hard decision like this, to submit to a decision that he, I'm sure, didn't agree with. And he does this. All right, verse 27, we're about to see that this doesn't really work. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple, because that's what, you finish the Nazirite vow deal by burning your hair. I know, sounds kind of crazy, but that's what they did. So they saw him there at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." Now, there was an area where the Greeks could hang out, but then I guess it's like the women quarters, and then there's the sign that you could not enter. If you were not a Jew, there was a sign kind of over this courtyard, and if you entered it being a non-Jew, it was punishable by death. They were so intense on this, a lot of times the Roman soldiers would let the Jews kind of just almost police their own thing. So this was a huge deal, all right? It wasn't just like someone just kind of hanging out in their church service. No, this was a huge deal. The Jews were very separate from everyone else, and they're saying that, hey, Paul brought this Gentile into the inner courts, which was punishable by death, and something you did not do. So this is what they're saying, and we see why they start to get absolutely crazy about this. All right, I think we're in verse 30. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions, seizing Paul. They dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. They were trying to kill him. News reached the commander of the Roman troops, and the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Thank you, Agabus. Then he asked who he was and what had he done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth, because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him." As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" All right, interesting here, and this is just for those of us that really enjoy, church history. there was this, where is I got it written down here, Josephus. He was a first century historian, and Josephus has helped a ton of us understand church history. He's helped us understand a ton that went on within the first century. And one of the things, just kind of an interesting aside, is there was an Egyptian that led all these different people as they're talking about. And in essence, there was a huge massacre. They were, you could kind of say, like zealots in a way. They were trying to overtake the Roman government by force. They had daggers and all kinds of different things. And the Roman military, in essence, decimated them. But the leader, this Egyptian guy, escaped. And so they're in the city, there wasn't like America's Top Wanted, but if there was like a Jerusalem Top Wanted, this guy certainly would have been at the top of the list. So this head soldier guy, commander, there you go, that's the first thing that goes off in his mind. He's like, wait a second, this might be him. And the more he talks to him, he realizes he isn't him. All right, that had added no value to your life, but it's just kind of an interesting historical thing that I really like. All right, do you speak Greek? Nope. He replied, aren't you the Egyptian who started? Okay, we already read that. Verse 39, Paul answered, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a city of no ordinary city. I mean, Tarsus was the bomb. It was an amazing, amazing place. Please let me speak to the people. Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. All right, so it's kind of a cliffhanger. We have to stop there because that's where the chapter ends, and I've already been talking for 12 minutes and 56 seconds. Okay, I made some different commentary kind of points along through it. Here's the one question I have. Everyone close to Paul told him not to go to Jerusalem. Paul knew what was going to happen if he got on that boat and he sailed to Jerusalem. Paul knew that what was waiting for him in Jerusalem was an even greater amount of persecution than he had experienced yet before in his life. He knew what he was walking into, yet he went anyway. And this has just really struck me today in two ways. One is, did he do the right thing? I mean, I'm just reading this. I'm like, man, shouldn't he have listened to his community? But then again, maybe there are some times where even those that are closest to us don't know exactly the step that we're supposed to take. Paul knew what was awaiting him in Jerusalem, but what moved him towards Jerusalem, which would eventually lead him to Rome and eventually lead to his death, was for him to do the will of God. I love Henry Nouwen, and he wrote this book, Can You Drink the Cup? And it really talks about the final hours of Jesus and the cup of sorrow. And can you and I really get to this place in our life where we say, thy will be done, not mine. It is about your will. It is about your kingdom, not mine. And here in the text, we see the crucible of this mission in unbelievable fashion. We see Paul go to a city and he knew exactly what was going to happen to him, yet he went anyway. And the only reason Paul went was because the will of God became higher than his own. So here's my question for you today. What is your Jerusalem? What is my Jerusalem? And don't think of it as in a city, all right? But maybe it's a conversation. Maybe there's a conversation that you know is going to be incredibly difficult, that you've been avoiding, you've been kind of dodging. Maybe it's confession, something that you need to confess in your life that could damage your reputation. Another one I have down here is a decision. Maybe it's just a terrifying decision that you need to make. What is your Jerusalem? What is something that is in your path right now that you are terrified to do, but if you do it, what will happen is it will refine you to the point where you would be able to say, as Paul was able to say, thy will be done, not mine. We'll see you guys in a little bit at Mission Church at 10 a.m. We're going to be talking about being distinctly courageous as we are seeing all throughout this book. Have a great Sunday morning. See you guys soon.